And we are in week 6. This seems really hard to imagine to me. I was kind of thinking about next week as well as we look at the city of Geneva, and there's this week and next week, and I was looking at that like week 7. I'm like, how in the world are we already to week 7 in this study? But time flies, we know. So we come tonight to an important chapter. I mean, if you were to think for a moment, who were kind of the monumental people that you speak about in the Reformation? The first one we're always going to come to is going to be Luther. I mean, he's such a massive figure in the Reformation. But the second one's going to be Calvin. It's not going? Okay. Suddenly I'm a trained monkey up here. Public speaking. Yeah, are we going? We going? All right, we're going to go ahead and you just try to get it figured out. All right, here we go. All right, so we were saying there's like 2 monumental figures in the history of the Reformation, and certainly Luther is one of them. Just a tremendous, towering figure in the history of the Reformation. We often credit him with kind of the beginning of the Reformation. We've tried to say that's probably not fair to all those that came before him and who were influences on him as well. But certainly he is an important figure, and the Reformation as we know it does in some sense begin with October 31st, 1517. But we've also tried to say there were other streams of reform happening for hundreds of years earlier. In fact, you could really say about 1,000 years earlier. And certainly there are other streams that would have continued even as far as we know if Luther had not been there. We talked about Zwingli and what happened in Zurich as being a stream of reformation that likely would have gone on anyway, even if there had never been a Luther. He doesn't seem to be as directly influenced by Luther as other reformers were. But the other major figure is obviously John Calvin. And when you think about this for a moment, it's interesting because those 2 figures could not be more different in the sense of when you think about Luther, what do you think about? You think about a guy who's physically imposing, a large man. Calvin was kind of a skinny, unimposing guy. And you think about Luther, and he was kind of bombastic and bold and boisterous. In fact, Luther was the kind of guy that he took over any room he was in. I mean, he just had that natural personality, and that people like that. They're gregarious and they're domineering in a sense. And wherever he was the center of attention. And Calvin was much more the kind of guy that would kind of slink off into a corner and just kind of be quiet. He was more introverted. And again, when you think about someone like Luther, he was very acid-tongued. I mean, we've spoken about that. He was quick to use parody or insult to achieve his ends. And Calvin was very much the opposite. Calvin was soft-spoken, and he was a scholar, and very much desired to convince you based on the argument itself, not on calling you a witless worm or something as the way of pummeling you over the head to get you to accept his reasoning. And it's interesting because when you think about this for a moment, it's really important to think about Calvin rightly, because the story of Calvin through the centuries has been written by this is just the truth, often by his sycophants, people who follow him blindly in whatever he said, no criticisms ever, which we understand people who admire someone tend toward that, or his enemies. And I would say for most of us in America, it's been more written by his enemies, people who hated him, and we've not heard really a fair account of him in almost any regard. It's funny because if you ask people oftentimes, what do you think about Calvin? They'll say, well, he was mean-spirited or hateful person or whatever it is. And you're just like, have you ever read a book on Calvin? Have you ever read a book written by someone who knew Calvin, including his opponents? This is not how anybody in his day described him. They described him as, if anything, to a fault the other direction. kind, loving, pastoral, trying to convince people of things. And not at all like Luther, who you might think of a little bit more in that way, you know. But Calvin seems to be almost the quintessential pastor, which is what's funny about his path, which we'll talk about in just a moment. As you read in your book, he was born in 1509 in Nyon, France, and there he was raised in a good home, a fairly middle-class home. A tragedy struck his home at an early age. His mother died, and that greatly affected him and affected his household, as you can imagine. His desire at an early age was to be in the Catholic Church in some way, Roman Catholic Church in some way. That was his desire. It was not his father's desire, although his father would have likely been pleased with that. The parallel here to Luther is quite astounding. Calvin's father thought, if I can get him into law and make him a successful lawyer, our family will kind of be set. That was what you did. That was a kind of tier of attainment professionally, that you could move up a class by becoming a lawyer. And so that was the goal. And so, as you probably read in your book, he was going on that path. In fact, even though he was kind of a committed Roman Catholic in his early days, that began to change. And most biographers will say that what began to change that in Calvin was he saw the persecution against the Protestants. And he didn't understand, why are they so angry against the Protestants? Like, what is the doctrinal charge here? And they would say, well, they say the Roman Catholic Church is corrupt. He's like, we all know it is corrupt. Like, we all recognize that. What's the problem? Well, he says that the Pope is not the vicar of Christ on earth. Do you really believe that? He would say. Do you really believe that Christ speaks through Peter or through whatever Pope is as his vicar on earth, that he holds the full authority of Christ? Well, you know, and the reality is, he didn't understand this hatred that was going on toward the Protestants. So that was a big movement for him, being sympathetic to Protestants. As he was pursuing his professional career that his father had kind of laid out for him, he went to the University of Paris and he studied humanism there. And that, it's interesting how many times humanism is a link in the development of these reformers. And you might think, why? Humanism we don't think of as a particularly Christian trade. But what humanism always emphasized was ad fontes, right? Back to the founts, back to the original documents, back to the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament, back to the foundational things. Don't accept the 1,000 years of built up arguments. Let's go back and see first and primarily what the Bible says, and then we can move on from there. So humanism was an interesting trade that led many people to Protestantism as they went that path and thought about it. It didn't immediately for Calvin. He was interested in the arguments. He was sympathetic to some of the arguments, but he was very much committed to, let's try to reform the church. Guess what? So was Luther. So was Zwingli. So are many of them. While they thought it could still be reformed, that's what they were shooting for. What happens along the way is he leaves the University of Paris, having graduated, and as you may have read, he decides to go on and study law at the University of Bourges. And there he's going to be a student of the law, and that was one of the most famous universities for law. So it speaks something of his academic credentials that he could get into there. And so he gets in there, he studies to be a lawyer. Again, I think very much like Luther, we think of a man very well trained in the law, very promising in the law, had a very legal rigor to his mind. If you think about different types of lawyers, I think that's where we'll see the difference between Luther and Calvin. There are the lawyers that are very meticulous in their development of an argument, point by point, argument by argument. And then there's the guys like Jerry Spence, if you remember that, the cowboy lawyer, and he'd come in and he would just overly passion an argument out in court and try to win you with the gusto of the argument. And I think Luther was probably more the gusto argument and Calvin more the meticulous argument being laid out before you. But he was dedicated to being a lawyer because that's what his father wanted. And he did not want to displease his father. And in fact, it wasn't until his father died that he gave up being a lawyer. Once his father died, he said, okay, now I can do what I want to do. I don't have to please him anymore. I'll do what I want to do. And that's another difference between him and Luther. Luther decided to make the break, which he thought was at God's command with a lightning strike. But anyway, he makes the change from law. But what's interesting is somewhere in this time, we're talking about in the early 1530s, 1530 to 1533, Calvin is saved. He comes to understand the gospel, and in a new and fresh way, God delivers him. And it's not clear when this is. Oftentimes, I think maybe even our book says 1533. Actually, our book, I see right here. Sometime during 32 or 33. Many of the more recent Calvin biographers are putting it at about 1530. We don't know. Calvin wrote a lot, but he wasn't writing about himself very often. One of the interesting traits about Calvin that's so in contrast to what's often accused of him is he hardly ever spoke about himself. Occasionally, nuggets in sermons where he would talk about some event in his life, but very rarely does he address himself in his sermons. And it doesn't seem to be about him. It seems to be about the gospel and about understanding the scriptures. And so we don't know exactly when, but there are some details in one of his commentaries on the Psalms where he mentions this moment where he was transformed by God's grace. And some scholars believe he's referring to the early time in, at the University of Bourges, that it was there that that this happened. So around 1530. We don't know, but that's just in case you're curious. It was a massive change. He underwent such a transformation that everybody noticed it. All those around him noticed he was a different person. It was a very radical, as he called it, a transformation that happened. And he increasingly became involved with Protestantism. As he studied it more, he became more and more convinced that the Protestants were right on key doctrinal issues. And this was a problem because, as we said, Protestantism was being persecuted in France. And so what's interesting is he had a good friend, Nicholas Kopp, who was a rector of a university there in Paris, in fact, the University of Paris. And he gave a speech that was very pro-Protestant and very questioning of the Roman Catholic Church. It was so profound that it caused a stir amongst the faculty. And many of the faculty reported him to the authorities for preaching heresy at a university event. So they put out an arrest warrant for him, the magistrates do, and suddenly there's an arrest warrant for Calvin. And people are like, why did he have an arrest warrant put out for him? And the reason was it was being said that Calvin wrote a good portion of the doctrine of the speech, or at least tutored him in the doctrine of it. And so there were dual arrest warrants, one for him and one for Nicholas Kopp. And so he has to go on the lam, so to speak. And he is traveling around France, staying at friends' homes and acquaintances' homes. And, they're not that much after him. He hasn't killed anyone, but he is a criminal. He's on the lam. And so they're looking for him. But he's able to move around and preach and teach until in 34, there is something called the Incident of the Placards, or the Placard Incident. And what this was, the king was not a Protestant, but he was not that, and if you went into French history, you'd realize there were many nobles that were pro-Protestant, many that were pro-Catholic, and he was kind of interested in keeping the peace as much as possible. The magistrates were fully against the Protestants, and the king kind of kept the peace. He'd kept them restrained because he also knew that if we signed that for instance, any Protestant that advocates Protestantism or takes a Protestant view of the Lord's Supper or whatever it may be has to be arrested, well, his niece would have to be arrested and his cousins would have to be arrested. And so this was a real problem for the king. And so the Protestants had been careful for the most part. And that's why the Nicholas Kopp incident was so disliked, because a lot of the Protestants in France thought he'd gone too far in his speech at the university. Because again, we've got kind of a makeshift peace. Yes, we can get arrested, but that's more or less it. There's not martyrdom, it's not extensive prison sentences, etc. And in the night, one night, people went all over Paris putting placards up on walls all throughout town, basically charging the Roman Catholic Church with blasphemy. Anybody supports them as blasphemers. And it was very upsetting, and actually got the king to say, you know what, the magistrates want a free hand to round these people up. They've crossed the line to round them up. At that moment, Calvin, who seems to have had nothing to do with the placard incident, in fact, he himself wasn't even in Paris at the time, he has to get out of town now. He has to get out of country because they are coming after people now. And he goes to Switzerland for a time, and in Switzerland, in Basel, he finds a safe haven. Basel was a safe haven for Protestants. It was a Protestant city. And there he settles down for a couple of years and goes to good work during that time. He writes his most famous work, the first edition of the Institutes of Christian Religion, which is kind of his theology work or summation of the key doctrines of the Christian faith. This will become, in its many editions, and Calvin spent his life reworking that book. Every couple of years he'd come out with a second edition, third edition, fourth edition, on and on and on, and it would always lengthen. I mean, it would get longer and longer and longer. And it is now considered one of the top 5 most influential books ever written in the Christian faith, and a very important work. And people immediately noticed something about Calvin and this work. He was easy to understand. He didn't have to go to like diatribes against his enemies to make his points. He had well-reasoned arguments, very logical arguments. And this book, which he thought, hey, I can send this back to France to my friends and they can circulate it as kind of like a statement of the faith, went everywhere. This book within a few years was everywhere. In fact, what's going to be interesting in a minute is how surprised Calvin is by that. But another parallel to Luther, who didn't think his theses were going to be spread all over Europe, and they were. But anyway, at this point, he stays there for a while, and he's looking for something to do. And so he goes to Ferrara, Italy. And the reason he goes there for a time is Queen Renee of France has taken refuge there. So when the incident of the placards happened, I mentioned the king was going to have to go against many members of the royal family, and Princess Renee was one of those members. And so she fled from France and took up residence in Italy, and Calvin went there to be her personal secretary at her invitation. Come and write letters for her. He was well noted for his manner of letter writing and just being an excellent communicator. And so he goes there to Italy and stays for an extended time, maybe a year and a half. And then he decides it's time to go back to Strasbourg, which we think of now as in France today, but in that day it was part of Germany, and actually for a time was a free imperial city, meaning it didn't belong to any nation. It was its own nation-state city, and city-state, I guess I should say. And so that was his desire, because Martin Bucer was there. And Martin Bucer was a man that he very much admired. And Bucer had been communicating with him by letter, which one of the neat things about Calvin is we have volumes of his letters. He was an amazing letter writer and communicated with many people that way. And he communicated with Bucer, and Bucer was like, come here. You love to do academic work. We'll put you up in an ivory tower. You can just do what you want. You can just study and write and study and write and study and write. And this sounded great to Calvin. Why? He wasn't really at first a people person. He liked kind of being off in his own office and writing and thinking through doctrinal issues and theological things and then writing them and not having deadlines like, if I've got a sermon on a topic, I've got to have an answer before Sunday because I've got to preach on Sunday, right? And he didn't like that. He wanted to be able to say, if I need 3 or 4 or 8 weeks, I have 8 weeks to figure it out, work through it, consult all the passages, talk to other people, get feedback, and then write. He didn't want to be a pastor. He never wanted to be a pastor. He wanted to be an academic. And so as he's heading back to Strasbourg, he comes very near the city, and he hears that up ahead there are soldiers on the road looking for fugitives. And he says, probably not smart for a wanted man to continue, a fugitive from justice, to continue down this road to Strasbourg. So he says he heard that the road up toward Geneva was clear, and then the road from Geneva to Strasbourg was clear. So he says, well, I'll just go up to Geneva. I've heard it's a great city. I'd like to find out more about it. Stay there at night, and then I'll head down to Strasbourg that way. And that was his plan. And really, the history of the church changed based on that roadblock and that plan. I guess it really didn't, because you figure the providence of God, these events were set to happen. But he goes up to Geneva, and Calvin thinks of himself as a guy who wrote an unimportant book, a itinerant guy going around teaching people theology, and who had served as a secretary of an exiled princess. And so, you might think that he would go into Geneva and want to see all the great reformers who were in Geneva, men like William Farel, that he would say, I need an audience with these great men. But he didn't. He later reported, he said, these men will not know who I am. They'll know nothing of me. I'm unimportant. I'm not going to waste their time. I'm going to get a place and stay the night, see the city, and head on to Strasbourg. But somebody heard that Calvin was in town and went to Farel and said, hey, John Calvin, that guy you've been talking about, is in town. And so Farel went and asked for an audience with him and met with him. And Calvin's mind was blown. It seems that he just could not believe anybody knew about his work. Certainly in a city like Geneva, that no one would have known about his work. And yet, what he's hearing is from one of the great reformers of his age, a man who had kind of taken Geneva as his personal area to try to reform, was sitting here saying, no, I've read your book. I loved your book. I think it's the most succinct book on the Christian faith that's yet written. I think it's incredibly vital to the church. And Calvin just sits there, can't even believe it. Well, at that moment, Farel says, listen, I've been working for many years here in Geneva to reform this city. Just like Zwingli did in his city, and Luther did in Wittenberg, and so on and so forth. So as Zurich and Wittenberg are reformed, and Strasbourg under Bucer, so that's what I'm trying to do here. And we've come a long way. But I can't continue alone. I need help. And I believe God sent you here to be the man. And Calvin says, nope, you got the wrong guy. You got the wrong guy. Let me explain to you what I want. I want a quiet office up in an ivory tower. I want to study. I want to think. I want to write. I do not want to deal with people and their messes and the difficulties of being a pastor. That's not what God's called me to do. I'm called to study. And Farel looked at him and said that God has called you here. He's brought you here this very night for this moment. And if you don't obey him, I pray he will curse your studies. That he will curse your studies. Well, it's amazing because Calvin respected him, and this shook him. Shook him to his core. This is a man that I respect, and I've heard nothing but good things about. Maybe I need to listen to this. And I think it was good that he did listen. He stays there in Geneva for a time. If you read your book, you'll know some of these key points. I'll try to fill in just a little bit of the details. As he was in Geneva that first time for a short period of time with Farel there ministering, they hired him as a lecturer or a teacher. And about Calvin, they hired him as that. And they tried to make changes. He thought that's what they brought him there for, to reform the city. So he said, look, let's adopt the catechism. Let's adopt a statement of faith. Let's rethink how we do communion, how often we do it. And at first, the city council was like, okay, we'll do these things. And he said, okay, but if we find that people are not living by their testimony, in other words, if they show up at church and they agree to the statement of faith, but they're not Christians, it's clear they're not Christians, the church has to have the right to discipline them. In other words, the church is the body that decides, are they members or are they not? And the city council said, well, we've really never done it that way. We kind of see the city elders as those responsible for the church in our area. Very common, obviously, in that age. And so we'll give it a try, but, we're not sure. Well, you've probably heard of the Libertines before. The Libertines were a party that loved freedom and sexual excess and everything else. And they were not happy with Calvin because Calvin was writing about sin and things that shouldn't be going on, and basically began to say, if you're engaged in these wicked practices, you're not a member in good standing of the church. What we call today church discipline, right? That's what it is. And this began to cause a bit of a ruckus, and Calvin and Farel's position were not real solid in Geneva. They barely had enough votes on the city elders to really maintain any kind of control at all. And there was a lot going on. You know, you can't really ever boil these things down to one thing. France was on the move, and certain enemies of Calvin's in Geneva were saying, how do we know he's not really with the French? And wait, William Farel's also a Frenchman. How do we know they're not trying to undercut us and undermine us, and the war's going to come and we're going to be just laid to waste because we have traitors in our midst? And of course they knew this wasn't true. They knew the French wanted to kill Calvin and Farel far more than anybody else did, or they at least wanted to arrest them. So it made no sense, but it was a convincing argument when you've got a populace stirred up. And so they finally told him, you know, no, you don't have the authority anymore. The city council pulls it back. We'll be the ones to decide who are members of the church and who are not. We'll be the ones to handle church discipline. We'll be the ones to decide how often there'll be communion and how you'll do communion. And this was important because the city of Bern had just gone through a kind of Reformation itself, in which they had decided there that you should use unleavened bread in communion. Now, what's interesting about that is this has been a debate since the very early days of the church, if you know this. The Orthodox used leavened bread. The West typically used unleavened bread. And then there were people like Calvin up to this point that didn't seem to think it mattered much if you used leavened or unleavened bread. They just used bread. And if you got unleavened, use it. If you got leavened, use it. But it seems like this was not a point of controversy, had not been in Geneva. But Geneva wanted to draw closer to Bern as sister cities. And so they told Calvin and Farel, well, here's what's going to happen. You're going to use unleavened bread. And in fact, the first time you're going to use it is next month at the Easter service. You will serve unleavened bread at the Easter service. So Calvin said, okay, well, since the city council thinks that they can tell us what to do, if they want to serve communion, let them come down and do it. We're not going to. So they didn't serve communion on Easter Sunday, which caused a riot in the church. Calvin's enemies rose up and said, this man is undermining the authorities. Isn't this why he got kicked out of France? Remember, they were just saying a couple weeks earlier he was an agent of France. Now they're pointing out France even kicked him out, you know. And so you see the way these enemies were. So the city council exiles them. You are done here. You leave Geneva. You're no longer welcome here. So Farel takes another spot in ministry where he'll remain for like the next few decades until his death. And Calvin goes to Strasbourg to work with Bucer, his original plan. Only what's amazing is the change that happened in Calvin in just that year and a half. He goes there not to be an ivory tower scholar, but to be a pastor. He goes there and he preaches, and he teaches, and he shepherds, and he does whatever they need him to do. And he'll never again seem to only want to be that ivory tower scholar he once had wanted to be. And he would later say that he had recognized God's call on him when he'd been in Geneva, that he was meant to be a pastor, and that he was thankful for Farel kind of getting involved in that situation and calling him there. So the events from there get interesting, as all history does. Geneva becomes a mess, no surprise. These factions that didn't like Calvin rise up and take control of the city. Surprise, they're liars and corrupt. I think within 3 or 4 years, 3 of the members of the council that displaced him and exiled him, one was charged with murder and went to prison. Another was charged with corruption, and I can't remember what the other one was, but they were all on the take. They were all bad people, of course. And so the city fell into disorder. The new ministers that came in kowtowed to the city council who were paying their salaries. Again, I don't think that's a surprise, right? Oftentimes, you listen to who's paying the bills, right? That's just the reality of it. And this is one of the dangers of the state-church combo that we've been talking about all through this study. And so the church is a mess. Nobody's attending. The attendance dropped off. I think it said, I read somewhere, half of what it was before Calvin left. And this was when Calvin was supposedly unpopular, right? But the new ministers had no respect because they knew they were corrupt. And in fact, some people were saying in Geneva, we might as well return back to the Roman Catholic Church because we're no less corrupt than they ever were, you know? So again, this is kind of the situation. Well, there's a an important moment that happens. There is an important letter written by Cardinal Sadaletto to the Genevan Council in which he says, I hear people are saying, let's return to Roman Catholicism. Well, let me be the first to say, we will welcome you back. Just come on home, and we will welcome you back. And he writes a surprisingly elegant and gracious letter, lengthy letter, about how, yes, we understand there's been problems with the Roman Catholic Church, but we are committed to welcome you back, and we won't ask you to do a whole lot, and we are working on reforming the church and all this sort of thing. And they say, okay, we know most of that's not true. By the way, by this time, most of those people that exiled Calvin are off the council. They're no longer city elders. And more moderate and people who were leaning with, hey, we need to fix this church situation, were on the council. And they said, well, who do we get to respond to this letter? Because it's convincing some people. It's a well-written letter. And they said, we need somebody really smart, somebody who knows theology, and somebody who writes really good letters. They said, let's get Pierre Viret to write this for us, who was a great reformer and a master apologist, but not really a theologian per se. They went to Viret and he said, don't ask me. He's like, I'm not going to write this letter. I'm not qualified to write this letter. He said, if you hadn't messed things up, you had the man to write the letter. I believe he's in Strasbourg right now. Go talk to him. So they say, how do we go to Calvin and ask him to write the letter for our city when we kicked him out? How do you do that? Well, they did it. They heard he was going to be in Germany at a European symposium of religion, so to speak, and they sent a person there to take the message and say, hey, listen, we know that you're probably not happy with us, and that you have no reason to write this letter for us, but we think you care about our city, and we think that you'll agree a response needs to be written to this letter. And Calvin says, say no more, I'll write the letter. No promise that he'll be accepted back, no apology offered, nothing. He just says, you need a letter, it needs to be responded to, I'll be happy to write it for you all. And he does. And he writes a letter that is so beautiful and powerful and logical and biblical that when the city elders read it, they say, what are we doing? What have we done here? Exiling this man from our city. And so they told him that he was no longer exiled, which, hoping he would come back, but Calvin said, there's a quote, I wish I'd written it down, but he said something like, I would rather be murdered 1,000 times than to return to that place where I was crucified 1,000 times a day, something like that. But within a short time, he's beginning to talk to Bucer and saying, I think it's God's will for me to go back to that place. As hard as it is, as difficult it is, they need people there. They don't have leaders. And Farrell's not going to go back. He feels God's got him at the church he's at. So Calvin goes back, and he goes and tries to get some arrangements with the city council, similar to what they had thought they had in place several years earlier, of a catechism and a confession and doing communion and setting up a religious body that would be over the membership of the church. And he's promised all these things. And unfortunately, in his later years of his life, it's hit and miss. Many times when he tries to say, hey, here's a person or two that clearly are not Christians, they're not attending church, they are engaged in all sorts of corrupt behavior, I can't in good conscience serve them the Lord's table because they're not repentant. And he said, we're going to remove them from the church roll or excommunicate them. And the city council said, what are you talking about? These are important people, And so soon enough, the city council yanked back authority from Calvin. When I say Calvin, he's the lead reformer of the city. He did not put himself often in those most important positions so that he would lessen his influence. He made himself the moderator, which, if you know anything about moderators are not supposed to inject themselves into business, but just make sure things are fairly moderated. And so Calvin tried to do that. But the point is that as this Reformation went forward, a lot of the promises that were made to him were not kept. And he was probably the most famous man in the world once Luther died. And it would have been very easy for Calvin just to say, I'll go somewhere else. But he was committed to reforming that city, and he stayed. And worked and said, hey, look, maybe we take an occasional step back, but we take 2 steps forward by God's grace. And so other things that he did that you probably read about, I think it was in this book. Part of my problem is I try to read several of the history books, and I can't remember what I read where, but he started an academy. I don't remember if that specifically was in here, but he started an academy in Geneva. And this was a religious school to train ministers and to train theologians, something like we would call seminary today or cathedral schools in the Middle Ages. And he said, anybody can come. If you're Roman Catholic, come. He said, we'll evangelize them till they're Protestant. We'll convince them of the truth by teaching them the truth. And he was confident. He was like, if you put Roman Catholicism face to face against Protestantism, we're going to win. So invite them in. It'll just be a means of, and he was so confident of these things. And that school will become really important. I'm going to not talk about it too much tonight because that's our subject for next week about Geneva itself. But many great men that God used to change nations and the course of history came to study in Geneva, and John Knox being one of them. But we will talk about that next week. But again, as you think through this, he began to set in place a lot of reformational ideas. He said we need to revisit the Lord's Supper. We need to revisit it. We need to have it more often. And this was another area where they were like, yeah, you have full control. He says, okay, we're going to go to monthly, or to weekly. And they said, well, now wait a minute, let's not get crazy here. We've been doing it quarterly. He's like, I thought you said I had full control. Within reason. So they settled on monthly. And but there were a lot of things that he did during that time that are important, that some of which stood and some of which didn't. But he was a great arguer for recognizing 2 different ordained authorities in the nation, and that being civil government and that being the church, and that they have separate spheres of authority, but they're not free from each other. So the way Calvin would come to frame this is, the government has no business telling us how to do the things of the church. Communion, that's not their business. Now, to keep peace, did he, cooperate? Did he find middle ground? Yes. But he always thought they were wrong, and he told them that they were wrong. And then the other thing he would have said is that the government has their own sphere of influence and their own sphere of authority. And so like he would have argued, when the church gets out here overly involved in criminal reform or something like that, that's really not the church's purview, that the sword is given to the state in those matters. And the church needs to, now let me say this, when I said they're not completely separate, he would say, but the church is still the moral compass of the nation, just as the state has the right of the sword to also protect the church. So they weren't completely free of each other, but he said we ought to respect each other's spheres. And so that was kind of a different take that Calvin had than some of the reformers had, who would have been more happy with state churches. Calvin, even where there's times where it looks like Calvin might be favoring a state church because he wanted laws, he saw those laws as coming out of the symposium or out of the religious court. So in other words, if you were a church member, we shouldn't see you going into a brothel. That's simple, right? So his idea was not that you'd be necessarily arrested by the civil authorities, but that the church was free to deal with you through church means, a church court. And that's what he was fighting for there. So when you read this book, you'll see in here criticisms of Calvin. Let me go to, I believe it is in, maybe on the last page here. Maybe you all remember exactly where it was. But anyway, there was, here it is. Still, there was a problem of the people appearing to obey rules and regulations of righteousness without true godliness. That's always going to be a problem, right? Of people giving an outer form of religion, but not having a change of heart. This, we would argue, is the large Old Testament problem, right? Of a people who are going through the motions of religion given to them in the cultic practices of the Old Testament, and yet, many of them weren't believers. And that's said to us many times in Scripture by the prophets themselves, that it's empty, that it's meaningless. Isaiah 1 says, quit going through the motions if they're just motions. So again, you have that. And then, so there's always going to be that problem. And then it says here, the records of the Great Council reflect a large number of children being born out of wedlock, So in other words, the criticism is they didn't have heaven on earth, right? It was a real place with real problems. If you can find a city ever that the gospel is so penetrated that there is no social problems, please let me know where it is. The Cadburys, Cadbury brothers who started Cadbury chocolate, they created a city, a Christian city, and it was set off from the world. And it was going to be the perfect utopia on earth, except guess what? It didn't last very long because it wasn't a utopia. It lasted for a while, but it wasn't a utopia. There's nowhere on earth that you're going to be able to say the church is, in this age, so successful that you're not going to have problems. But it says here also that there were ecclesiastical sentences of death being passed down for witchcraft and heresy. Let me just say I'm not denying that that's possible. I am denying that I've read that anywhere else. One of the big problems that Calvin had with the Symposium was that was the body that was supposed to be able to adjudicate church matters, was that they wouldn't even let them adjudicate membership matters. But now we're supposed to believe they were allowed to adjudicate executions of citizens. I just don't, I can't say it's not true. I'm betting against it being true. I've never read that anywhere else. In fact, if Calvin had that much authority, we're going to come to the Servetus episode in a minute. And Calvin certainly didn't get his way fully on that at the hands of the civil authorities. So again, it mentioned here that Calvin's own son-in-law and stepdaughter are listed among those condemned of adultery. And again, I'm sure that if they were caught in adultery, they were put under church discipline by the church court. Of course, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. And so again, sometimes it seems like these charges are like, you can't believe how big a tyrant he was. Read up on the Anglican Church, read up on the Lutheran Church. They were doing the exact same things. They took seriously the code of conduct of their church members. And it might conflict with our kind of modern day American ethic of individuality and freedom from anybody else saying anything, but that certainly isn't the context of the church from the very beginning up until the modern age. And so I don't see how you're going to hold Calvin in contempt for something that was very normal for his day. And then it says here, the single darkest spot on the overall glorious record of the great reformer is Calvin's part in the case of Michael Servetus. This is a difficult subject because Calvin's enemies will always run to this, say he had Michael Servetus burnt at the stake. And that is literally not true, but we want to deal with it for a moment. So Servetus was a brilliant man. Now, wrong theologically. His brilliance did not extend to theology, but he was a doctor. He was a mathematician. He was a polymath. He knew many disciplines of math. He was the first man to ever properly diagram the circulatory system of the human body. So this is not a small league intellectual. This guy's super smart. But he came to believe, through some things that he had read, that the Christian faith had been corrupted. You've heard these arguments by Constantine and by the Roman government. It got corrupted. And that nothing that's been handed to us at all is trustworthy. Well, this is more like the Anabaptist argument than the Reformers' argument. And he argued that the doctrine of the Trinity was corrupt, that there is no such thing as the Trinity, that they have made three gods in the Bible instead of one God, and the Bible says there's one God. He rejected the Nicene Creed. He rejected all the historic creeds of the church, and basically held to something we would call modalism, where you argue that there's one God and we relate to him in three different perspectives. So I've given this example, I think, last week, but we'll do it again. The classic framing is to say to Ricky, I'm a father, to Allison, I'm a husband, to my dad, I'm a son, but I'm really just the same person, right? It's just I have different roles. And the church from the very earliest days said that is not what the Bible says. The Bible shows that there are three persons, right, who are God, but one God. And again, this is a difficult thing to talk about, but he rejected this framing. And I think Michael Reeves, in his book, Delighting in the Trinity, which is in our library, says something like this: the Bible is so Trinitarian, the New Testament is so Trinitarian, that if you didn't have the framing of the Old Testament, that there is but one God, O Israel, that we would be far more likely to think there are three gods than one. So again, you can't deny the idea in the New Testament that it is strongly telling us Jesus is God, the Father is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. But the Bible tells us there is but one God. And this is how the doctrine of the Trinity was formed by really smart people struggling with it. And somebody saying, oh, I've got a great analogy. The Trinity is like a three-leafed clover. And somebody going, no, that's a terrible analogy. Or it's like water. No. Let's stop these bad analogies. It's hard to really summarize God, right? He is greater than all the things that he's created, and it's hard to do this. So again, Servetus was going out and saying, no, these people are wrong. If Servetus lived today, we would call him like an internet troll. That's probably what you would think of him as, because what he would do is he would just love to write letters to people, tearing down their arguments. And so for some reason, when Calvin was in Paris, he wanted to meet with Calvin. And he probably thought he could convince Calvin that he was right and that Calvin cared enough about the Bible that he would agree with him. And they didn't end up getting to meet because of the placard incident. Calvin had to leave. And so Servetus started writing him regularly. Whenever he found out where he was, he would write to him and he would say, hey, I read your thing and here's all the problems with it. And he got more and more condescending because Calvin would write back to him and argue and say, I think you're missing this point and think about this. And if you're right, then that means that all the church has always been wrong until you, right? And that you alone wise over all the church through all the years. And how does that make sense if there's a faith once and for all handed down to the saints? And Servetus would come back and say, you don't get it. And just very bombastic and ugly to the point at which Calvin basically told him, we're done. I'm not writing back to you anymore. Servetus wrote a book rejecting the Trinity and sent it to him. Calvin said, okay, I'm going to try to be gracious one last time. He sent a copy of the Institutes back to Servetus, which Servetus took and marked up and sent it back to him, telling him all the errors that he'd made in the Institutes. Quite bold. And kept writing to Calvin even after Calvin told him, I'm not writing to you anymore. And for years he would write to Calvin and just lampoon him and all these things. And Servetus had just been condemned in Spain, now in France, in Italy, in England, everywhere. He was being condemned for his heresies. And he said, I want to come to Geneva and I want to have a public debate with you. And Calvin said, you realize you're a fugitive in every country that exists. He said, I can tell you for a fact, if you come here, you will be arrested and you'll be executed. I mean, that's the law. You're a heretic. And he keeps saying, I don't care. I'm going to come and debate you. I'm going to come to Geneva. We need to meet face to face. We need to talk. Can't you secure me a pass that I can come and meet with you? And like I said, Calvin only wrote a couple times after he said never write him again. The one I just mentioned, and then another time where he said, listen, I don't have the authority you think I have. The city elders are in charge of the government. And there's no question in my mind, even if I write you a pass and you come, they will arrest you and execute you. No question about it. Do not come here. Do not come here unless you want to die. And so a couple of weeks later, Servetus puts on a pretty weak disguise, enters into Geneva, comes to the church to hear Calvin preach, and somebody recognizes him and says, Servetus is here, Servetus is here. He's quickly arrested. The authorities take him, charge him with heresy. He is convicted. And for years people say, oh, Calvin was the ringleader wanting him burned. Calvin thought he should pay with his life. I don't want to in any way soften this. That was everywhere. Everybody held heresy as a capital crime in those days. Philip Melanchthon, we talk about Luther being so bold, and everybody says, Philip Melanchthon was so reserved and kind and patient. Philip Melanchthon wrote a letter to Calvin thanking Geneva for putting him to death. So you have to understand how common this was in that century. It is not the standard we use today. People in that day were arguing maybe we shouldn't always do it, but it was the law in that day. If you were a Trinitarian heretic, you would be put to death. We know from a letter that Calvin wrote to Farel at his new station. He wrote to him and said, I went to the city elders. I'm paraphrasing. He said, I went to the city elders and I said, listen, there's something wrong with this guy. There's no question about it. He seems to be nuts. But wouldn't it be better for us to just lop his head off? If you're going to kill him, do it in a way that would at least be humane. And they said, look, the law says heretics are burned at the stake. He's going to be burned at the stake. Now, even our book here makes it out to be as if Calvin is the one driving this whole thing. Calvin certainly consented to him be executed, thought he should be executed. But it's pretty clear from Calvin's own letters that he had tried to intervene so that he wouldn't be burnt at the stake. And in fact, the reason Calvin had no power, and again, I encourage you to read some biographies on Calvin if you want to learn more about these things. But Calvin had almost no pull during that period of time with the city council. Things had turned against him again. Some of the Libertine party had gotten back on the city council. He didn't have the same authority. And in fact, the city elders put a Libertine as judge over the trial. And so again, Calvin had almost no pull in that trial. That doesn't mean, again, Calvin would not have consented to being killed. But again, it's just to say people don't really deal with him honestly or fairly. And anywhere you see, and I would just point this out, it's amazing, anywhere you see Calvin's enemies speak about him in his day, all they have to say about him is he's the kindest person, the most warm-hearted, genuine person. They'll just say he's wrong. He's wrong on an issue or two. But Calvin is nowhere this cold, mean-spirited person that many people portray him to be today. In fact, there's a book out, I think, something about John Calvin as pastor that just goes through his pastoral side and how caring he was, how self-sacrificial that he was. In fact, I don't know if it's in this book. It is, because I highlighted it and I just looked down and saw it. Pope Pius IV said of him, the strength of that heretic, because of course to the Pope he was a heretic, consisted in this, that money never had the slightest charm for him. If I had such servants, my dominion would extend from sea to sea. He was never accused of any kind of corruption or power seeking. If anything, his own enemies testified how humble he was. And, we often talk about his work ethic. The Protestant work ethic comes from really two main people, and that is Luther and his theology of labor, theology of work, and Calvin, who is an example of what it meant to be a hard worker. Calvin said, every moment I'm up, I need to be working. I need to be at it for God's glory. And he was. Generally, he was. He preached, this is considered impossible today in most churches. He preached 9 sermons or lectures every 2 weeks. So he preached 2 times on Sunday, each Sunday, and every other week he lectured 5 days a week. And many churches today, a preacher will preach Sunday morning only and preach Sunday morning maybe 40 times a year, something like that, 40 sermons a year. And he was preaching 4.5, 5 times a week and preaching or teaching. And so again, it's an extraordinary output, but his dedication. Toward the end of his life, his friends said, look, John, you've got to slow down. You're killing yourself. He said, there's work to be done. There's work to be done. So it's an amazing thing. I want to talk a little bit about Beza tonight, but I'm not going to have time to because we're going to be short on time. But I want us to save that next week as we look at the city of Geneva. We'll come back to Beza and some of the lasting influence of Calvin. I also want to say there's much that can be said about Calvin and Calvinism. Notice tonight we didn't once bring up some of the things that he's most noted for because they weren't even necessarily major themes in his ministry. They were always in the background: predestination, sovereignty, what we call the doctrines of grace. But I would argue in some regard, unless somebody else initiated those conversations, Calvin wrote about them in institutes, but he was not one of these people going out like, let's have a lengthy discussion on these things. In fact, much of the doctrine that we think of as Calvinism was developed after him by Beza and his later students. Things like tulip, of course, that came from the canons of Dort. That was nowhere near Calvin's own life. And a lot of the developments that we think of are often lumped in with Calvinism in terms of even predestination, and the Lapsarian debates all came after Calvin. He believed in the sovereignty of God. He believed in what the Bible said. If the Bible says that he predestined people, he predestined people. If it says he elected people, he elected people. Calvin was very much what the Bible says, I believe, and went to work explaining those things and how do we understand these things. But again, the irony, I think, in all this, and why you don't hear me talk about Calvinism very often, is no one would have hated that worse than John Calvin. This man who debated whether or not his name should be on the institutes, for instance. This man who over and over again seemed to be very humble and not seek to be at the head of the parade, so to speak. I can't imagine how much he would dislike that his name is associated with any kind of religious movement. He was one of those guys, I think, who would have said, I think maybe it was Spurgeon, I don't remember, some of you remember, who say, live anonymously, preach and die for God's glory. And it does seem like for Calvin, that was the goal, be helpful, serve the Lord, die, and leave a new generation trained up to step in and inherit the blessings of the work that's been done. In one of his writings, he wrote in the introduction that just as Titus could thank Paul, I'm paraphrasing, as Titus could thank Paul for laying the groundwork for his work in Crete, so I need to thank Farel, who laid the groundwork for the Reformation in Geneva. Calvin didn't even think he should get the credit for that. So again and again, where you see him, he's not as enemies have portrayed him. And I would just say, if you've heard this terrible caricature of Calvin that's often said in the modern world, take time to read a book by him. One thing you'll find when you hear people just destroy his character and destroy him, ask them, what books have you read on Calvin? What do you really know about Calvin? And you'll find they've almost never touched a book on Calvin, never read about him, know nothing about him, don't know his doctrines, can't explain them. As far as I'm concerned, that's a violation of the bearing false witness commandment, because you are bearing false witness against a Christian brother by not knowing what you're saying and charging him with stuff that just is false and not true. So people need to take time. You want to go after Luther for some of that stuff we talked about a few weeks ago? He did those things. But again, if there's stuff with Calvin that you think, if you want to say they should have never executed anybody and that because he was for that, that's wrong, okay, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But you got to remember people in the time in which they lived and the standard in which they lived. And I will say this, there is no Puritan movement in the English church without Calvin. And without the Puritan movement, there is no Presbyterian church, there's no congregational churches, and there's no Baptist churches. So all of us trace our heritage back to this man and the ministry that he had in Geneva. And that's just the truth. The Puritans were trying to implement his writings in light of the Church of England and some of the same questions that Calvin had. How much authority should the state have over the church? And what happens if we disagree with the state on these matters? What does the church do? And the Puritan movement, of course, was we need to make the church more pure. So that's kind of where all that comes from. All right, well, that's all I really need to say about Calvin tonight. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask or comments or observations? Yes, sir.
So Calvinism, like this, or protectorate England, no music, no gambling, no theater, anything like embarrassing.
So he would have been against all those things that you just said, yes. But he would have done it in the context of, where you're talking about the Church of England, or some of these debates like Oliver Cromwell. Yes, it's a good example. It's a good example. Calvin would have argued that any time the church is too tied to civil government to where the church becomes the government or the government becomes the church, there's going to be problems. But his argument would have been pretty clearly in Geneva, would have been if you're caught gambling or whatever the case is, then the church should be free to deal with that, not the state government. He would say if gambling's a crime, then let the state government deal with it. But if gambling's not a crime, but the church says it's wrong, then let the church handle it. And that would be through the process of church discipline. And so he wanted the church to be free to deal with its true members when they broke God's law, so to speak. And the state could deal with breaking man's laws.
I've got one lighthearted disagreement.
Okay.
And two comments.
Okay.
Lighthearted disagreement. One of Calvin's books that I've read, it was on the doctrine of free will. It was
yes.
a response to a Roman Catholic theologian.
Yes.
Critiquing his institutes. But in that book, John Calvin calls him a prostitute working in the brothel of the Antichrist.
Yes.
So there were times where Calvin could use some
There were.
I just wanted to.
I appreciate that. Yes. You said you had something else? Let me respond to that real quick. Can you remember what you're going to say? So there are moments like that. And there's no doubt. But that is like normal for Luther, right? That's like every other paragraph for Luther. For Calvin, they stand out. You know, it's like those black sheep in the field that stand out. He also was, when someone told him one time that there was a good pope in Rome, and they said to Calvin, they said, that man is fit for heaven. He said, as far as I hear, he's not even fit for the earth. You know, so Calvin had his zingers too, for sure. But anyway, go ahead.
And the two other things. So in Calvin's response to Cardinal Setaletto,
Yes.
there's two things I think are really interesting about the letter and are worth mentioning, especially since we're talking about what the Reformation was about.
Sure.
And especially what it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Two of the things that he brings up in that letter, which is really great, when he's talking about the nature of the church and his disagreement with Setaletto, he says, we do not disagree with the ancient church. Like, we're not
Right.
trying to break away from that. And he lists all these early church fathers that span like 500 or 700 years of the church. And he's saying, that church we have full agreement with.
Yes.
What we're saying is that y'all have corrupted what the church was handed.
Yes.
And the second comment is one of the interesting things when he's engaging with the cardinal, he doesn't quite say that every single Roman church is just cast away by God. One of the interesting things he does is he's saying, we don't believe that y'all are the one true church. Instead, we're saying there are churches among you that are true, but they've still been corrupted by the papal tyranny and corrupt doctrines, things like that. And I think that's really important for understanding what Protestantism was claiming. It isn't that we're now the one true church and all the other ones are fake,
Right.
rip-offs and things like that. Instead, it was this claim that the one true church is expressed in different ways. And so that leaves room for differences of tradition, like Baptist, Presbyterians,
Sure.
Anglicans, and Calvin would even say some Roman Catholics and
Yes.
many Eastern Orthodox.
I agree. I think the interesting thing there about that is, and actually, let me remind me, there's something about Calvin I want to say about that. But at first, you know, this is, I remember years ago hearing R.C. Sproul say, he said, I've got Catholic friends that are Christians. He said, that I believe that they are saved by God's grace through faith, those hallmarks of what it means to be a Christian. And I remember him saying, he said, well, I always ask him, why won't you break from the Catholic Church then? You know, but certainly in those early days, all the reformers had hopes that even Roman Catholic congregations would have faithful preachers and would believe the gospel and that sort of thing. I think over time, where you might trace the end of that sort of argument, not that that the hope wouldn't still exist, but where you see kind of a more clean and final break, is probably as part of the Counter-Reformation, as the Roman Catholic Church kind of doubles down. And on their end, they begin to say, that, if you hold to these doctrines, then you are anathema. And, we'll go through the Counter-Reformation if we get to it. But it's important to see that in the early days, they saw continuity themselves with the early Catholic. It's the reason our Apostles' Creed, we still say the Holy Catholic Church, right? Because we believe that there is a church that spans back throughout this entire age. We as Baptists argue even a little back further, but that all believers are a part of, and that all those who are truly the elect of God, those who have faith in Christ, born again by the Spirit, that these are part of that church, and that it never disappeared from the face of the earth, and that it's evident clearly in the early church. That's what I think you're saying there, evident in the early church. And that's why the Reformers never dismissed those early, what are often called ecumenical creeds. Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, and the Chalcedon definition, because they said those are good and solid and products of the true church. and that where that continues forward, there's corruption, and to varying degrees, churches are not churches. And that was a big debate in the Reformation, is what defines a church? Like what is it that defines a church? It can't be somebody standing up here, because Roman Catholics that we would say were not a good church had that. So they began to say, well, it's the preaching of the gospel. And I think that's your point. A lot of those reformers said there were still Catholic churches that were preaching the gospel, you know. So there's a lot to wrestle through. I agree with that. Did you make all your, or something else you want to say? Okay, perfect. But no, that's a good point. And, you know, I think that part of what happens over the course of the Reformation is the battle lines get more defined. That happens as, I think particularly, you know, Trent and some of these things come along, and the Catholic Church puts down their boundary and says, you go further that way than this, and you're anathematized. And so I think that there was a period of time, I think, in Calvin's life where there was higher hope that the Reformation could still be won, even congregation to congregation, you know, in a sense. But anyway, it's an interesting point, and I appreciate it. And goes to the point we've been trying to make all along, that the Reformation, they never thought they were inventing something, or they never thought they were doing something novel. They thought, if anything, they didn't think they were breaking away from the true church. They were saying, in a sense, the true church, the Catholics kind of corrupted away from that, or broke away from the apostolic teachings, or however you want to describe it. They didn't really use that term apostolic teaching. That was more the Anabaptists who like to say that. But still, what we would recognize as going back to the apostolic age. Any other questions, comments, anything?
Just a comment.
Sure.
You know, we talk about, you know, Calvin not liking the idea of, Calvinism. I don't want my name tied to this.
Right.
It seems like the idea of Calvinism is also kind of taken as like just Reformed theology wholesale. And
Yes.
like, I think he'd hate that. That's kind of the things like,
I 100% agree.
I'm just a Calvinist. Well, there's more to it. There's a lot more streams.
Yes.
And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. So Spurgeon has a sermon. It was written out into a book, and he says, when we speak about Calvinism, we use this as a nickname for the gospel. But I'm sitting here thinking Calvin would be even more upset now, right? He's like, don't call the gospel Calvinism, right? Call it the gospel or whatever. But yeah, so I think all the attempts to make this better, Calvin would not be happy. He would not be happy, because he was such a person that worried about idolatry, and he would have hated the way, even the statues that they made in Geneva. You know, you've got Beza, and I don't remember who else there, Farrell, and he, and I think there's a fourth, and I mean, he would hate that. I mean, you know, it's like, tear those things down, you know. But anyway, but that's just his mentality, right? Was that man should be, I should decrease, let him increase, right? That kind of mindset that John the Baptist had. Any others?
So I hear you say that Calvin, his focus was on keeping order, discipline in the church.
Yes.
And yet it feels like from this book,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like the author is leading me to believe that Calvin was trying to bring Christianity to the civic sector and make it a Christian town.
Right.
And go after pagans. What's the truth?
So this is hard. This is hard because this will confound the church for like 400 years moving forward. Because the reason this is so hard to parse out, which is it? Is Calvin just wanted to focus on the church, or is he wanting to Christianize the culture? Well, the answer is yes, he would like to do both of those things, but is he trying to enforce, like have a theocracy? And the problem here is very much what I mentioned on a Sunday morning of the debate going on between Martin Lloyd-Jones and Billy Graham with the crusade in London. You know, on the one hand, you've got the argument that every English citizen is a member of the Anglican Church. And that was the argument in England for years. Every English citizen is a Christian in one sense of the meaning. They're a member of the church. And, you know, when Billy Graham is trying to sit here and think, well, how do we do a crusade, and where do we send people to what churches? These things come up. Again, I recommended a book, Evangelicalism Divided, if you want to read more about these things. But it's always a problem where you have this overlap. Who are truly in the church and who are truly citizens. And so what's happening in Geneva is, on the one hand, Calvin says, I'm supposed to discipline the church. That's one of the roles of a pastor. The civil authorities saying, well, that's everybody in our town. Everybody's a citizen. Right. And he's saying, well, I don't think that's right. But through discipline, we'll know. I mean, over time, if we start bouncing people out, right, then we'll know they're not or whatever. And the city said, ooh, you can't do that. You know, so this is why these lines are so hard to draw, because on the one hand, he's saying, I want to have church discipline because the Bible tells us to. And that's one of the three marks of a Reformed church, as the Reformers generally laid it out. Preaching the gospel, the sacraments being administered, and church discipline. Those are generally the three held up, the three primary marks of a church. He said, so we have to have church discipline. And they're saying, well, then that's everybody. And he's like, so, okay, but if I don't believe they're Christians, how do I enforce morality on them if I think they're pagans? And so he wanted the right to say, let's bounce them out of the church, and then they're your problem, city government. But they said you can't bounce them out. So this is, I think, why there's such a problem there, because how do you then exercise church discipline when the city tells you everybody is your church? And that's, again, Calvin really thought the solution here was to have some parsing of this and say, let's start bouncing people out that don't belong in the church, that aren't Christians, they don't believe, and they'll be happier because they don't want to be in the church and they don't want to follow these rules. They want to go down to the red light district, so to speak, and you know, I'm sure he'd been happy to get rid of the red light district anyway, but again, the idea is these were difficult issues and will remain difficult issues with the state church problems that'll happen throughout Europe for centuries. They will continue to be problems, and the same problem in essence, you know. And the government having a heavy hand in telling the church what its boundaries are, that's an issue, you know, a real issue. Hey. Anyway, all right, but that's a really interesting subject, and one that I would say is one worth studying. We'll see a little bit more of it in this study, those kind of dilemmas, but particularly next fall in kind of modern church history. That will continue with the state churches and many of the problems. So, all right, any other questions, comments, objections? Yes.
Dealing with, practicing Roman Catholics, President Biden, Speaker Pelosi.
Yep.
And them, it's almost turned over 500 years to where the people in the church are running away from the teaching, as opposed to in Calvin's time, it feels like the people were trying to go the other way and help lead the whole city to Christendom.
Right.
It's just kind of interesting.
There's a lot of interesting things when you think about that. I mean, certainly Calvin was, everything that Calvin was concerned with, and that's one of the things that's interesting about him, is scriptural. I mean, he was trying to find scriptures to tie to anything, and you'll often find that the polemics against Calvin don't quote a lot of scriptures to refute his positions. It's like, it's just they're using logic or appeals to emotion or whatever. But yeah, I think that they all had a dream that Geneva could be a Christianized city. I'm sure he would have loved that. And I think all the reformers at one time thought, what's possible? Because, they didn't know. And, we'll come back to this, but Knox will later say of his time in Geneva that it was the perfect city. Like it was as close as you're going to get during that era that he was there to, I don't have the quote written down, I'll have it next week, but to just being a great and godly city. And that it was a city that seemed to be a moral city and a peaceable city, and a city in where most of the people were Christians and tried to live their life as Christians. And so, I'm sure that for many of us, we think, wouldn't this country be better if our churches were stronger and more people identified as Christians and lived by Christian ethics and loved one another, and wouldn't it be better? But like you said, we're kind of living in an age now where there's a whole lot of questions about things. You mentioned there, and it kind of goes, I think, in a minute with what Nathan was saying of Calvin was very gracious even to Catholic scholars. One of the reasons why he was chosen to write that letter in the end was he was such a good letter writer and reasonable and passionate. Luther's not the guy you would have wanted to write that letter, which I think our book mentions that Luther himself pretty much said that's why he had Melanchthon at the end of his life writing everything. But there are questions like, one of the big debates in our time was evangelicals and Catholics together, where the idea, can we work with Roman Catholics on things like abortion and things like that, and opinions vary greatly, right? We know J.I. Packer kind of sided with the yes, we can work with them on certain points, and famously R.C. Sproul climbed up on top of the table and we cannot, and because again, his fear was what we're saying is that even our understanding of the gospel are similar, and that we have to make that distinction, that there are things maybe we can work on, but we need to always have that distinction that we believe in salvation by faith alone, through grace alone, in Christ alone. And I think that's one of the things Sproul said to Packer was, you can get the Catholics to agree we're saved by faith. They just won't say alone. But that one word makes a huge difference, right? So anyway, those are things that we're still debating. How much can we work with people that don't agree with us on every point, or even maybe major points, right? How big a difference does it have to be before we say, no, we can't work with you? For some people, it would be just a slightly different Baptist, right? We can't work with them, And for somebody else, it would be, we can't work with Mormons or what. But those are things we have to wrestle with. And rather than going to another Baptist joke, I'll stop now. Oh. Anyway, any other questions?
Do you know anything about his short marriage? Because it barely mentions it.
Yes. So there's not a lot to say about it, really, because Calvin, like I said, just didn't write a lot about himself. So we know that he was a big advocate for priests marrying, and he thought it was ironic because he was getting older and he had never married, and he kept saying it's kind of ironic that I'm one of the largest advocates for marriage and I'm not married. And so he asked Bucer and Farel to help him find a wife, and then he found one, and apparently it was a very good marriage. I mean, just he was kind of famous by that time, and so he said, I don't want somebody because I'm famous. I want somebody who'll be a good and suitable and godly wife. And they were married, just for that brief period. I don't remember off the top of my head how many years, but it wasn't a long time, 10 years or something like that maybe. And then she got sick and died. But his one of the things that we do have that he wrote, and Banner of Truth has a book of some of his key letters that he wrote, and you can read them for yourself and see how great a letter writer he was. But he expresses in a letter after his wife's death how hurt, how broken he is by it, and you can see that he really did have a lot of affection for her. But again, he wasn't, except for a personal letter to a friend. He's not going to be in a sermon talking about his home life. That just wasn't his style, And so we don't. Those are a lot of things like that. There might be a biography that deals with that. If I can find one, I'll let you know. But I don't remember reading a whole lot more. I mean, a little bit more than this book will say, but I don't remember reading a whole lot more. But it's not like Katie Luther, who Martin was always talking about and writing about. And so we know quite a bit more about her and their home life. And to all of his students who were in his home wrote about their marriage and their life and how they kind of were a model for them. So I don't remember that as much with Calvin. So, all right. Well, if nothing else, then we'll have a word of prayer and a couple of verses of a song. By the way, we're going to sing a song that Calvin wrote tonight, so you can hear a little bit of him as a hymn writer. And with that, we will have a word of prayer. And somebody is upstairs. I'm going to go make sure there's nobody up there that shouldn't be up there while you lead us. Oh, let's have a word of prayer first. Father, we thank you for this day and for this time. We praise your name and give you thanksgiving for this time. In Christ's name, amen.